What if the Black Death had not stopped Mongol expansion? If Alexander the Great had not stopped at India, but pressed further into the heart of China, would the world today still be ours or someone else's? History often hinges on such fragile pivots, and sometimes the smallest forces redirect the greatest storms. Now imagine another pivot, one darker, more world-shaking. What if the Black Death had not crippled the Mongol war machine at the very height of its westward expansion? What if Europe, fractured and vulnerable, had met the thunder of Mongol cavalry not weakened by disease, but at the peak of its unstoppable momentum? The Mongol Empire was no ordinary dominion. Forged in the 13th century under the iron will of Genghis Khan, it spread like fire across the steppes, engulfing kingdoms, dynasties, and civilizations with terrifying speed. From Korea to the Caspian Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, the Mongols carved out the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. Their armies were lightning, disciplined horse archers, hardened siege engineers, and ruthless strategists who measured victory not in castles captured, but in civilizations broken. By the early 14th century, Europe had already glimpsed their shadow. Mongol armies under Batu Khan smashed Hungarian and Polish forces, burning cities and annihilating armies. Only the sudden death of Ogedei Khan in 1241 forced the Mongol princes to retreat, sparing Europe a conquest it was utterly unprepared to resist. For a century afterward, Europeans lived in dread of the horseman's return. That return came, slowly, through the power of the Golden Horde, the westernmost khanate of the empire. From their base on the steppes north of the Black Sea, Mongol armies continued to dominate Russian principalities, demanded tribute from princes, and cast their gaze westward once more. The Balkans, Hungary, even the great bastions of Christendom were whispered to be within reach. And yet, fate intervened. Not through armies of knights, nor through papal decrees, but through a silent, unseen killer. The plague, traveling along the very trade routes the Mongols had opened, spread from Central Asia into their camps, their garrisons, their cities. When Mongol forces besieged the Genoese outpost of Kaffa in Crimea in 1347, their own soldiers began to die in droves. The disease, which would become infamous as the Black Death, killed more Mongols than any sword could. Their armies faltered, their supply lines crumbled. Their empire, stretched across continents, staggered under the invisible hand of death. In our timeline, that plague spilled into Europe, killing perhaps a third of its population, but also sparing it from Mongol domination. A paradox of tragedy. Europe was devastated, but it survived free. The Mongol tide receded, not because knights prevailed, but because pestilence had done what no human army could. But let us imagine differently. Let us peel away the sickness from the story. Imagine the siege of Kaffa ending not with Mongols weakened, but with Kaffa burned to ash, its defenders enslaved, its Genoese merchants slaughtered. Imagine Mongol armies not retreating in exhaustion, but rallying with full strength, their cavalry poised on the threshold of Europe. No plague, no collapse, only conquest. In this world, Constantinople does not watch from afar as Mongols fade, but feels their presence at its gates. The Balkans tremble, Hungary falls once more, and the Danube becomes the artery of invasion. The 100 Years' War between England and France continues to bleed Europe's strength, leaving the continent fragmented, leaderless, unprepared. The question ceases to be whether the Mongols could invade Europe. They had already proven they could. The question becomes how far they would go, whether Paris, Vienna, even Rome itself would one day fall under the banners of the Great Khan. And so our story begins, at the edge of a Europe not yet ravaged by plague, but standing unknowingly before a storm of hooves and fire. The Mongols were not mere raiders who struck and vanished into the steppe. They were masters of logistics, intelligence, and psychological warfare, as disciplined in planning as they were merciless in execution. By the mid-14th century, they had already shown Europe a glimpse of their power. At Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary, entire armies had been destroyed within days, their knights and infantry cut down by the precision of mounted archers and the thunder of cavalry charges. The only force that had ever halted them was not a battlefield defeat, but the death of a Khan in far-off Mongolia. Fate, not strength, had spared Christendom. In our history, plague became the next savior of Europe. At the siege of Kaffa, when Mongol catapults hurled corpses infected with pestilence over the walls, their own ranks were already collapsing. Disease killed soldiers faster than arrows. The horde withdrew, broken by an enemy too small to see. But in this alternate path, there is no such collapse. The plague never takes root in Mongol camps, or spreads only mildly, leaving their armies intact. Kaffa falls. The Genoese, who had once carried the seeds of disease into Europe, are themselves carried away in chains. The Black Sea becomes a Mongol Sea, its ports turned into supply stations for campaigns westward. In a world without the Black Death, Europe's fate would have been dramatically different. The siege of Kaffa would end in flames, not plague. The Genoese outpost would fall, and the Mongol armies would surge forward with renewed strength. Constantinople, already weakened and isolated, would become a prize ripe for the taking. The walls that once defended against centuries of invaders would buckle under the weight of Mongol siegecraft, and the city's fall would send shockwaves through Christendom. From this moment, the tempo quickens. Constantinople, long the weary sentinel between east and west, finds itself staring down the full might of the steppe. The Byzantine Empire, already a faded shadow of its glory, is a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. The city's famed Theodosian walls had once stood against Arab sieges and Latin crusaders, but against the Mongols, walls alone cannot suffice. Chinese engineers, experts in gunpowder bombs, counterweight trebuchets, and siege towers taller than ramparts, are brought westward, augmenting Mongol tactics with devastating technology. The fall of Constantinople, which in our reality came in 1453 at the hands of the Ottomans, happens here a century earlier beneath the banners of the Golden Horde. The consequences ripple outward. With Constantinople burned or bent to Mongol rule, the crossroads of Europe and Asia changes hands. Orthodox Christianity is subjugated, its patriarchs forced to swear loyalty to the Khan. The remnants of Byzantine authority dissolve, their lands absorbed into a new Mongol province, stretching from the Black Sea to the Aegean. The Balkans, already fractured by rival lords and Ottoman pressure, collapse swiftly into submission. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece become tributaries. Slavic princes, who in our reality balanced between Mongol tribute and independence, find their chains tightened until they bite into the bone. For Western Europe, the fall of Byzantium is more than a distant tragedy. It is a warning. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land are now subject to Mongol taxation. Merchants crossing the Black Sea find their ships seized. News spreads like wildfire. The Khan has taken Constantinople, and his generals are marching west. Yet Europe is distracted. England and France bleed each other dry in the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire, less a unified state than a quarrelsome confederation, cannot rally. Italy is divided between rival city-states and mercenary armies. There is no Christendom, only fragments, and fragments are easy prey. The Mongols do not rush blindly. They probe, they scout, they exploit division. Their cavalry rides deep into the Balkans, testing resistance, burning villages, leaving survivors to spread terror ahead of the next wave. Everywhere, rumors precede them, of entire cities slaughtered in a single night, of towers built from severed heads. These are not exaggerations, but deliberate weapons of fear. Where the sword cannot reach, dread prepares the way. As the 1350s dawn, the road into Central Europe lies open. Hungary is once more in flames. Vienna, gateway to the empire of the Germans, stands vulnerable. And beyond Vienna lies the heart of the continent, the Rhine, the Seine, the plains of France. The storm is gathering, and its riders are not content with the east. The question that lingers like smoke over Europe is no longer whether the Mongols can come, But who among them will be left to resist when they do? Europe in the mid-14th century was a patchwork of fragile sovereignties, a chessboard of kings, dukes, and bishops, each guarding their corner while quarreling endlessly with neighbors. France and England were locked in the Hundred Years' War, bleeding men and coin for dynastic pride. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling but hollow, was a mosaic of princes who obeyed more out of custom than loyalty. Italy seethed with rival republics, mercenaries, and papal intrigue. To the Mongols, this was not a continent of united resistance, but a feast already carved into pieces. When the horsemen of the Golden Horde crossed the Danube once more, Hungary was the first to feel the storm. Decades earlier, it had survived only because fate recalled the Mongols eastward. This time, there was no reprieve. Mongol cavalry swept across the plains like wildfire, surrounding fortresses, bypassing strongholds, and striking at the undefended heart of towns. Budapest was razed, its churches burned, its survivors herded westward in chains. The terror spread faster than the armies themselves. Peasants fled into forests, lords abandoned castles, and whole villages emptied at the mere whisper of hooves. The papacy, exiled in Avignon, issued desperate calls for a crusade, pleading for Christian unity against the invader. Yet the kings of Europe were deaf. England and France were too entangled in their private war. The German princes of the empire argued over precedence and tolls. Italy watched nervously but remained divided. Venice and Genoa, too concerned with trade. Florence with its own mercenaries. Christendom had no sword to match the horde. By 1355, Mongol banners reached Austria. Vienna, proud and wealthy, faced siege. Its walls were tall, but Mongol siegecraft was taller. Trebuchets hurled stones that shattered towers. Fire lances borrowed from China spewed terror into the night. Within weeks, Vienna fell, its gates broken, its streets painted red. From there, the heart of Europe lay naked, and yet Europe was not the open plains of China or Persia. Its dense forests, its rivers, its jagged mountains complicated the Mongol style of warfare. Cavalry could sweep across plains, but in alpine valleys, ambushes lurked. In marshy lowlands, horses struggled. Resistance did not vanish entirely. Isolated castles held out for months. Monasteries became fortresses of last faith. Peasant bands, armed with scythes and crossbows, harassed Mongol columns. Though slaughtered in the end, they revealed that the continent could bleed the conqueror, even if victory was hopeless. But the Mongols were masters of adaptation. They recruited local levies, conscripting defeated knights into their armies, bending blacksmiths to forge European-style armor, and forcing conquered engineers to strengthen supply lines. Their empire was not only a machine of destruction, but one of assimilation. Each conquest fed the next. The Rhine Valley's grain became Mongol rations. Captured carpenters built bridges across rivers. Enslaved scouts guided cavalry through forests. Every piece of Europe consumed was remade into fuel for its own subjugation. The psychological weight crushed resistance as much as swords did. Survivors spoke of entire towns erased in a single day, of noble families executed to the last child, of heads piled high in markets as a warning. Panic itself became a Mongol ally. Where fear went, resistance broke. And so, as the decade wore on, the Mongols advanced deeper, their scouts reaching as far as the plains of France. Paris trembled, not at English armies, but at the rumor of steppe horsemen crossing the Rhine. England, shielded by the Channel, prepared for isolation, knowing that if the continent fell, the island would be next. For the first time in history, Western Europe faced the specter of becoming not the seat of its own destiny, but a distant province of an Asian empire. Yet conquest raises another question. Would the Mongols merely dominate, or would they seek to reshape Europe in their image? The Mongols did not conquer for plunder alone. They marched under a creed of universal dominion, sanctioned by the eternal blue sky. To resist was not simply rebellion, it was blasphemy against destiny. This stark worldview left little room for compromise. Those who submitted were spared, taxed, and folded into the empire's machinery. Those who resisted were annihilated. Europe, with its proud castles and fractious lords, soon found itself confronted with a simple ultimatum: bend the knee or perish. In the territories already subdued, the Mongols imposed their familiar order. Tribute was demanded, census records drawn, and governors appointed. Merchants and artisans, if they paid taxes, thrived under the Pax Mongolica, moving goods along roads suddenly patrolled by mounted guards. Local churches were tolerated, bishops allowed to preach so long as they swore loyalty to the Khan. Religious freedom was not born of compassion, but of pragmatism. The Mongols valued obedience above all else. The feudal order of Europe, however, began to unravel. Nobles who once held power through inherited privilege saw their castles bypassed or reduced. Mongol centralization drained authority from local lords and redirected it to administrators who served imperial governors. Whole regions that had followed the rhythms of knights and vassals now answered to a bureaucracy modeled on Chinese, Persian, and steppe traditions. The old ways did not vanish overnight, but they bent under pressure, like iron heated in a forge. Paradoxically, culture did not wither entirely. The Mongols had long valued skill, wherever they found it. Just as Persian astronomers and Chinese engineers had been carried across the empire, so too would European scholars be drawn into the orbit of Karakorum and Beijing. Latin manuscripts might find their way east, copied into Mongol archives. Stonemasons from France could be compelled to build fortresses along the Volga. Even poets might be summoned to the Khan's court, their verses preserved in languages they never imagined. The Renaissance in this timeline might not ignite in Florence, but be scattered across Mongol capitals, its light refracted, delayed, but not extinguished. Still, domination breeds resistance. The Ottomans, who in our history rose from the ashes of Byzantium's decline, find their ascent strangled before it begins, trapped between Mongol provinces in Anatolia and the Black Sea Fleet. Instead, defiance takes root further west. In Iberia, hardened by centuries of fighting the Moors, small Christian kingdoms cling to survival, shielded by mountains and the Atlantic. England, buffered by water, watches the continent's collapse with dread, but also with the advantage of isolation. And in Italy, the city-states, wealthy and stubborn, weave intricate strategies of survival, sometimes resisting, sometimes trading, sometimes bowing, always scheming. Venice and Genoa, though battered, strike bargains, offering ships and commerce in exchange for fragile autonomy. Their galleys slip across the Mediterranean, carrying both tribute and contraband. To the Khans, they are useful tools, to be tolerated for now. To their neighbors, they are traders buying time. Yet in that ambiguity lies the seed of future resistance, for wealth and the sea provide weapons that the horsemen cannot easily match. The stage is set for a struggle, not merely of armies, but of civilizations. Europe bends, yet does not break. And beyond the western horizon lies a new world, unknown to Mongol eyes, unseen by steppe scouts, a world whose discovery could change the balance of history, if only Europe survives long enough to reach it. The westward surge of the Mongols reshaped the very arteries of trade. In our reality, it was the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 that choked Mediterranean commerce and drove Europe to seek new routes. But here, with Constantinople captured a century earlier by Mongol armies, the grip is even tighter. The Silk Road is theirs. The Black Sea is theirs. Every caravan and ship pays tribute to the Khan. Europe's lifelines run through Mongol toll stations, and with each coin collected, the empire strengthens. This suffocation forces adaptation. In Lisbon and Porto, Portuguese sailors gaze at the Atlantic not as a mystery, but as a possible escape. If the roads east are barred by Mongol tariffs, perhaps new ones can be carved across the ocean. The same thought arises in England, its monarchs keenly aware that their island's survival depends on freedom from Mongol chokeholds. What began in our history as cautious exploration now becomes a desperate necessity, a gamble for survival. By the 1370s, the Portuguese crown sponsors expeditions along the coast of Africa, their caravels probing further with each voyage. England, though embroiled in war with France, secretly invests in shipwrights, crafting vessels that can withstand long voyages. Knowledge spreads of the compass, of lateen sails, of celestial navigation, faster than in our timeline, spurred by urgency. Each Mongol tax levied in the Mediterranean becomes fuel for maritime innovation. The Mongols, land-bound by tradition, underestimate the sea. Their fleets, though formidable on rivers and short coasts, cannot rival the expertise of seafarers shaped by storms and tides. They see the Atlantic as a wilderness unfit for conquest. To Europeans, however, it becomes a refuge and a weapon. From the very pressure of subjugation emerges a paradox: the seeds of Europe's escape from the continent itself. Yet danger remains. What flag will fly on these ships? Will they bear the cross of Christendom, or the seal of the Khan? Could Columbus, in this altered world, set sail not under Spanish banners, but with a charter granted by a Mongol governor in Lisbon? Would the Americas be discovered in the name of a distant Khan, claimed not by Christendom, but by the heirs of Genghis? The implications are staggering. Imagine the Aztec meeting emissaries who claim allegiance to Karakoram. Imagine the Inca falling not to conquistadors, but to Mongol-backed adventurers, armed with Eurasian steel and guided by centuries of imperial logistics. The New World, rich in gold and silver, might flow eastward through Mongol-controlled trade networks, enriching Asia while keeping Europe shackled in tribute. And yet, it is precisely here, in the unknown waters of the Atlantic, that Europe's chance for renewal survives. The Iberian kingdoms, hardened by frontier wars and desperate for independence, embrace the ocean as both shield and sword. England, watchful from across the Channel, prepares to follow. The Mongols can dominate land, but the sea remains beyond their full grasp. Thus, by the closing years of the 14th century, the stage is set for a race between conqueror and conquered. The Mongols push deeper into the heart of Europe, their banners reaching the Rhine. But at the edges of the known world, sails are rising, carrying men westward into uncharted waters. The next frontier is not a battlefield of horse and bow, but a vast ocean that promises either salvation or another chapter of conquest under the shadow of the Khan. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Mongol Empire of this alternate world had not collapsed into a loose patchwork of khanates, as it did in ours. Without the plague's devastation, its manpower remained intact, its legitimacy less fragile. Rival branches of Genghis Khan's descendants still quarreled, but resources were abundant enough to sustain fragile cohesion. What emerged was not a single absolute empire, but a reinvigorated dominion stretching from Beijing to Paris, a great web of tribute and authority woven tighter than before. In Europe, Mongol administrators built their authority with cold efficiency. Austria, Hungary, and the Balkans became provinces governed by satrap-like officials. Local nobles who swore loyalty retained fragments of power, but always beneath the shadow of Mongol governors. Cities such as Krakow, Vienna, and Prague were transformed into provincial capitals, their cathedrals looming over markets now taxed for the benefit of Karakoram. Silver from Bohemia, wheat from the Hungarian plain, and timber from the Carpathians flowed eastward in endless caravans. Europe's riches became fuel for the empire's machine. Culturally, a strange synthesis began to form. The Mongols, pragmatic as ever, allowed Latin Christendom to persist, though humbled. Popes, if they wished to keep their dignity, were forced to acknowledge Mongol supremacy. But in return, European artisans and scholars found themselves drawn into a wider intellectual world. Persian astronomy, Chinese engineering, and Arab medicine now circulated through networks that linked Paris to Samarkand. The compass, the astrolabe, mechanical clocks, and even crude gunpowder weapons spread more swiftly, though always under Mongol auspices. The Renaissance would not begin in Florence's workshops, but in hybrid courts where Mongol Khans commissioned both steppe chronicles and illuminated manuscripts. Yet beneath this apparent unity, cracks deepened. The sheer size of the empire strained communication. Riders carried dispatches along vast roads, but months could pass before orders reached the edge of Europe. Subject peoples, outwardly submissive, harbored growing resentment. In Germany, towns with strong civic traditions resisted imperial tax collectors. In Italy, city-states schemed in shadows, trading bribes for autonomy. And far to the east, in China, new voices whispered rebellion. Ming partisans, heirs of the Song dynasty's memory, stirred the countryside, testing the empire's resolve. The sea, too, threatened the Khans. Atlantic kingdoms, hardened by necessity, Nixisidi, had begun to challenge Mongol dominance with their fleets. Portuguese caravels raided Mongol ports along the western Mediterranean. English ships struck supply convoys in the Channel. Though minor irritations compared to steppe campaigns, they revealed a vulnerability the horsemen could not easily close. The empire's fist was iron on land, but on the oceans it struck like sand. Still, the empire endured. The Pax Mongolica, reborn, stitched Eurasia together in ways unseen in our history. Merchants traveled from Paris to Beijing under the same banners. Scholars debated Aristotle in Samarkand. Soldiers who had once fought in Europe found themselves garrisoned in Persia or Central Asia. It was a world unified by conquest, yet haunted by rebellion, stretched between brilliance and fragility. The question hanging over the 15th century was simple. Could the empire adapt to the pressures of distance, diversity, and change? Or would it, like all vast dominions before it, break apart under the weight of its own ambition? The 15th century unfolded as a contest of endurance. The Mongols, flush with the spoils of Europe, sought to expand their dominion beyond landlocked power and into the seas. It was a realm unfamiliar to them, yet their ambition knew no boundaries. In the Mediterranean, shipyards once belonging to Venice and Genoa were seized. Local craftsmen, under the stern supervision of Mongol governors, built fleets meant to carry the authority of the Khan across the waves. Expeditions sailed south, striking Tunis, raiding the shores of Egypt, and even threatening the Mameluke strongholds that had once defied Mongol arms. For a brief, dazzling moment, the Mediterranean seemed on the verge of becoming a Mongol lake. But the sea was never the steppe. Horses could not gallop across salt water, and the skills of Mongol generals faltered when stripped of open plains. Naval campaigns drained resources and relied heavily on subject peoples who chafed under Mongol command. Sailors obeyed out of fear, not loyalty. Battles at sea dragged into stalemates. Storms shattered fleets, and supplies ran short. The empire's momentum slowed. Meanwhile, on the Atlantic's far edge, a different story unfolded. Portuguese caravels crept down Africa's coastline, pushing farther with each year. Castile, though inland territories bent beneath Mongol tribute, funneled wealth into its ports, nurturing mariners who dreamed of freedom. England, isolated yet resilient, invested in long-distance ships that could raid Mongol supply lines. Each voyage westward or southward was more than exploration. It was rebellion disguised as discovery. Within Europe, resistance hardened into open defiance. In Bohemia, the Hussite movement erupted, its warriors wielding wagons and early firearms against imperial garrisons. Their cries were not only for religious reform, but also liberation from Mongol overlords. Again and again, Mongol armies descended on the region, but the Hussites, fighting with unyielding zeal and unconventional tactics, resisted. For the first time, the horde faced not knights charging in open fields, but a disciplined militia that fought on its own terms. The spark of rebellion spread. In the Alps, mountain communities ambushed caravans and melted back into the peaks. In the Low Countries, merchants refused taxes, fueling uprisings in guild halls and marketplaces. Even in Italy, city-states long adept at compromise began to test the boundaries of Mongol tolerance. Florence financed mercenaries to resist encroaching governors. Venice played a double game, supplying tribute with one hand while secretly arming rebels with the other. The empire responded with brutality. Massacres scarred the countryside. Cities that resisted were leveled, their populations deported eastward to repopulate distant provinces. Yet every act of terror planted the seeds of further revolt. Martyrs were made. Legends spread of villages that fought to the last man, inspiring others to rise. Fear, once the empire's greatest weapon, began to falter. Still, the Mongols remained formidable. Their armies were vast, their coffers deepened by tribute from 3 continents, but the cracks were visible. For the first time in over a century, whispers of imperial weakness passed from tavern to monastery. Europe, though scarred, was not conquered in spirit. Its people endured, and endurance itself became a weapon. The Mongol grip on the continent was not broken, but it trembled. The question now was whether the empire could evolve into something lasting, or collapse under the weight of seas, rebellions, and its own overreach. The 16th century dawned, and with it came the thunder of a new age, the era of gunpowder empires. In our timeline, the rise of Spain, the Ottomans, and later the Mughals and Safavids reshaped the balance of power. But in this altered world, where Mongol banners still cast their shadow across Europe, the story unfolds differently. The Mongols had known gunpowder for centuries, carried westward from China. They had used crude rockets and fire lances at sieges, terrifying their enemies. Yet their hearts remained tied to the cavalry bow, the thunder of hooves, and the freedom of the steppe. Tradition slowed their adaptation, even as their subjects began to master the weapons of the future. In Bohemia and the German lands, rebels hidden among forests and fortified towns acquired arquebuses smuggled from Atlantic ports. Cannon foundries and secret workshops produced weapons that could shatter Mongol siege engines. Once, castles had been vulnerable to Mongol trebuchets. Now, with gunpowder on the defender's side, the balance began to tilt. Battles that had once ended swiftly in slaughter now dragged into bloody stalemates. The horde remained fearsome, but no longer invincible. Across the sea, another transformation unfolded. Driven by desperation, Portuguese and Castilian sailors crossed the Atlantic earlier than in our world, their voyages accelerated by Mongol control of European trade. What they found was a new world brimming with civilizations, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, societies destined in our history to fall before Spanish steel. But here, the conquest did not belong to Spain alone. It came under Mongol suzerainty. Governors in Lisbon and Seville claimed discoveries in the name of the Great Khan. Conquistadors swore oaths not only to their kings, but to distant overlords, and the wealth of the Americas flowed not merely into European courts, but across caravan routes leading eastward into Asia. The sight would have been staggering. Caravans carrying New World silver from Iberian ports, guarded by Mongol soldiers, crossing Europe into the heart of Eurasia. Gold from the Andes, harvested under the whip of colonizers, would pass into Mongol treasuries. The Americas, in this alternate reality, were not a European project, but an imperial one, tied to the legacy of the steppe. Yet with this expansion came danger. The distances were immense, the loyalties uncertain. Colonists who carved out kingdoms in Mexico or Peru were far from the eyes of Mongol governors. Resentment brewed. Why should men who risked their lives in jungles and mountains send wealth eastward to khans they had never seen? Rebellion, that familiar European disease, began to creep across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Mongol garrisons found themselves besieged by ideas as dangerous as gunpowder. Printing presses spread heretical pamphlets, calling not only for reform of the church, but for liberation from Mongol rule. Faith fused with defiance. Protestant sermons became rallying cries, binding nationalism to spirituality. The empire that had once broken its enemies with fear now faced an opponent it could not easily kill, an idea multiplying like sparks in dry grass. The Mongols still controlled vast wealth, their armies still numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Yet the world was shifting under their feet. Gunpowder roared in Europe's towns. Sails rose on the Atlantic, carrying whispers of independence, and across the seas, in the jungles of the New World, new frontiers opened. frontiers that promised both limitless treasure and the seeds of future rebellion. The empire was vast, but could it last? That was the question as the 16th century marched forward, carrying both the thunder of cannons and the whispers of revolution. The 17th century arrived, an age of upheaval even in our own history, marked by wars of faith, revolutions of science, and the rise of centralized nation-states. In this altered world, with Europe still under Mongol dominion, those same forces erupted, but twisted by the weight of conquest. The continent was no longer merely divided by Catholic and Protestant, king and noble, city and countryside. It was divided between those who bowed to the Khan and those who dreamed of breaking free. Science itself became a contested ground. In our world, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler dared to challenge the cosmos with observation and reason. Here, such men still existed, but their patrons were not European monarchs or free cities. They were Mongol governors, hungry for knowledge that could yield military advantage. Astronomers charted the heavens for the empire's calendars and artillery. Mathematicians refined ballistics, not for scholarly pride, but for sieges. The seeds of the scientific revolution still sprouted, but under the shadow of imperial oversight, their fruits harvested first for conquest. Religion, however, refused to be tamed. The Protestant Reformation, which in our reality tore apart Christendom, took on an even fiercer edge. Martin Luther's defiance of Rome was now doubled as defiance of Karakorum. Pamphlets smuggled through forests and river valleys spoke not only of faith, but of freedom from foreign masters. Every sermon railing against indulgences also hinted at rebellion against tribute. Protestantism became more than a theological movement. It was a political firestorm, uniting towns and peasants alike in resistance. Uprisings flared across the empire's European provinces. In the German states, militias armed with muskets defied Mongol garrisons. In Bohemia, rebels fortified their cities, fighting not only for faith but for survival. The 30 Years' War, which in our timeline devastated Central Europe, here became a war not between Catholic and Protestant princes, but between subject peoples and their Mongol overlords. The scale of slaughter was the same, but the enemy bore banners from the steppe. Across the Atlantic, too, rebellion simmered. Colonists in the New World, conquistadors turned governors, settlers carving plantations, resented sending gold and silver eastward. They asked why the wealth of Peru should line the coffers of a Khan thousands of miles away. Whispers of independence stirred in taverns from Mexico to the Caribbean. Some colonies declared themselves loyal only to their local leaders, daring the empire to bring its fury across an ocean it barely controlled. The Mongols struck back where they could. Cities were burned, rebels executed, printing presses seized. Yet the empire's might, once unquestioned, now seemed stretched thin. The sea was an enemy they could not master, the ocean a shield for rebels, the forests of Europe a hiding place for defiance. Even fear, once their greatest ally, began to fail. The world in the 17th century stood at a crossroads. Would the Mongols adapt, embracing gunpowder, navies, and the politics of early modern states? Or would they cling to their traditions, trusting the horse and bow to hold an empire whose subjects now dreamed of freedom? The answer was far from clear, but one thing was certain. The empire that had once seemed eternal now faced challenges not only from without, but from within. And history had begun to ask a dangerous question. Could even the heirs of Genghis Khan hold back the tide of change? The 18th century dawned with new ideas stirring across Europe and the Atlantic. Ideas that, in our world, we call the Enlightenment. Philosophers wrote of liberty, reason, and the rights of man. But under Mongol dominion, those words carried an even sharper edge. They were not just abstractions debated in salons. They were weapons, smuggled in pamphlets, whispered in taverns, and preached in marketplaces. The notion that all men were born free struck like a blade against the chains of tribute and foreign rule. In Paris, where Mongol governors taxed trade routes, circles of thinkers gathered in secret, hiding manuscripts that denounced tyranny in all its forms. In the German provinces, students at universities recited Locke and Rousseau not as theory, but as prophecy. The Enlightenment became a banner of resistance. Every declaration of natural rights was also a declaration that Europe should no longer bow to Khans across the steppe. And revolutions followed, where in our history the American colonies rose against Britain. Here, the uprisings targeted Mongol-appointed governors who ruled in the name of distant emperors. In Mexico, in the Caribbean, in the silver-rich Andes, settlers declared that their loyalty was to their own assemblies, not to Karakoram. Across the Atlantic, the cry for independence was louder, more desperate, and carried the promise of reshaping not just colonies, but the entire world order. Europe, too, ignited. In Bohemia and Austria, rebellions merged with Enlightenment ideals, demanding both religious freedom and political sovereignty. Italy's city-states fanned the flames, their merchants funding revolutionary presses. Even in France, long a jewel in the empire's crown, hunger and anger boiled. When bread grew scarce and taxes grew heavier, mobs shouted not only against local governors, but against the Mongol system itself. The empire answered with repression. Garrisons marched. Rebels were executed in public squares, and whole towns suspected of sedition were deported eastward. Yet each act of violence only spread the ideals further. Martyrs' names became rallying cries. Secret societies flourished, linking Paris to Prague, Lisbon to Krakow. What once had been scattered sparks was now a raging fire. Gunpowder, too, had matured. European rebels no longer fought with bows and improvised pikes. They wielded muskets and artillery, sometimes stolen, sometimes smuggled from sympathetic Atlantic powers. The Mongols, still clinging to their cavalry traditions, found themselves increasingly outmatched on battlefields where firepower mattered more than speed. Their empire, once the embodiment of unstoppable momentum, now appeared brittle against disciplined lines of musket-wielding revolutionaries. The Enlightenment, in this alternate history, became not just an intellectual movement, but the death knell of Mongol dominion in the West. Ideas that in our world toppled kings now threatened to topple Khans. The struggle was no longer about conquest, but about the very shape of civilization. As the century closed, the stage was set for cataclysm. Europe and the Americas alike seethed with rebellion, and the Mongol Empire, stretched thin across continents, faced an enemy it could not simply ride down. The conviction that people could govern themselves. The storm of revolution had begun. The 19th century dawned upon a world scarred by centuries of Mongol dominion, yet now shaken by the thunder of revolutions. Across Europe, uprisings that had once been scattered and desperate coalesced into powerful movements. In Germany, student leagues and militias joined forces, not under the banner of a king, but under revolutionary ideals of unity and independence. The patchwork of duchies and principalities, long tributaries to the Khan, began to dream of one nation forged in defiance rather than obedience. Italy, too, stirred. Its city-states, wealthy but suffocated by imperial governors, became hotbeds of secret societies. Merchants and poets alike whispered of a free Italy, no longer chained to tribute. When rebellion erupted, it was not simply a cry for national identity, but for liberation from centuries of foreign domination. Across the continent, the language of revolution, liberty, fraternity, sovereignty, became inseparable from resistance against the heirs of Genghis Khan. The Americas blazed with equal fervor. Colonies that had endured Mongol-appointed governors now declared themselves republics, adopting constitutions modeled on Enlightenment ideals. Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean cast off their suzerains, their assemblies proclaiming independence not from kings in Madrid or Lisbon, but from Khans in distant Asia. What began as local defiance soon spread into continental waves of independence, a mirror of our own world's revolutions, but turned against an empire that spanned continents. The Mongol response was brutal, yet faltering. Armies still marched, but they were stretched thin. Suppressing rebellion in Europe meant weakening their grip in Asia. Crushing dissent in the Americas left garrisons vulnerable in the Middle East. The once mighty war machine sputtered under the impossible task of ruling so many peoples, each with their own rising sense of nationhood. The very tools that had once united the empire, roads, trade routes, and communication networks, now carried seditious pamphlets and revolutionary songs faster than soldiers could silence them. By mid-century, the tide was irreversible. Germany proclaimed unification under revolutionary banners, casting out Mongol governors. Italy erupted into independence, its republics welding themselves into a new nation. France, long restive, finally tore free, its revolutionaries storming palaces that had once housed imperial administrators. Across the Atlantic, republic after republic solidified its sovereignty, forging alliances that spanned oceans. The Mongol Empire retreated eastward. Its heartlands in Central Asia and China endured, but the dream of a global dominion was broken. Yet even as its banners fell from Europe's cathedrals and castles, the legacy of Mongol rule remained etched in every corner of the world. Centuries of shared administration and forced connection had woven Eurasia together in ways no rebellion could completely sever. Languages, technologies, and cultures had fused. Russia bore the imprint of the steppe, more Mongol than Slavic. Persian science, European philosophy, and Chinese innovation intermingled in strange hybrids. By 1850, the Mongols still held vast lands, but their empire was a shadow of its former might. What had once been unstoppable thunder was now a distant echo, reverberating through history. The age of nations had arrived, and the empire that once claimed eternity found itself fading into memory. The 20th century dawned upon a world utterly unlike the one we know. Europe, scarred by centuries of Mongol domination, entered the modern age weakened, its nation-states young and fragile, still recovering from the long night of tribute and foreign rule. Asia, by contrast, stood at the center of history. The Mongol heartlands in Central Asia and northern China had become the crucible of industrial might. Factories rose along the steppe, powered not by kings of Europe, but by the descendants of Khans who had learned to wield coal and steel with the same ruthlessness once reserved for horse and bow. The Industrial Revolution, in this alternate reality, was not a British story, but an Asian one. Steam engines roared in Samarkand and Karakoram, weaving together railroads that stitched the empire's surviving core into a formidable industrial bloc. Gunpowder had been the empire's ancient gift to the West. Now electricity and steel became the East's inheritance. The balance of the world was reversed. The West lagged behind, fragmented and weakened, while the East surged forward, carrying the momentum of centuries of dominion. Wars still came, for empires never die peacefully. The great conflicts of the 20th century erupted not between Germany and Britain, but between a resurgent East, still bearing the imprint of Mongol centralization, and the rebellious Atlantic world, determined to assert its independence. The trenches of Europe filled again, but this time the flags above them bore not only eagles and lions, but the eternal blue of the steppe sky. Some battles mirrored our own history, yet their players were altered, their causes reframed, their destinies twisted by the long shadow of the Khans. Even the atomic age emerged differently. In our history, the first nuclear fireball lit the desert skies of New Mexico. In this world, it might have been the windswept plains of Mongolia, where scientists, descendants of scholars dragged across Eurasia generations earlier, unleashed the power of the atom at the bidding of a Khan reborn as industrial emperor. The Cold War, too, found new shape, not between the Soviet Union and the United States, but between a fractured West, clinging to freedom, and a vast Eastern dominion forged from centuries of Mongol survival. And so the question lingers, what would it mean to live in such a world? A world where the Black Death never came to halt the horsemen of the steppe, where Europe's destiny was bent under the hooves of Mongol cavalry, and where the modern age rose not in London or Paris, but in Samarkand. And Beijing, would progress have been faster or slower? Would liberty have triumphed or been smothered beneath an empire that sought eternity? In the end, this alternate history reminds us of the fragility of our own. The world we inhabit exists not because Europe was strong, but because disease intervened at a decisive moment. An invisible plague, carried by rats and fleas, halted the greatest war machine the world had ever seen. Without it, the map of our present would be unrecognizable. So ask yourself, would you want to live in that world? A world of vast empires and hybrid cultures, where Europe was humbled and Asia reigned supreme? Or do you prefer the chaos of our own timeline, where plague brought death but also preserved the seeds of freedom? History is shaped by the smallest turns. Sometimes it is a battle, sometimes a king's death, and sometimes it is a germ too small to see. If the Black Death had not stopped the Mongols, the story of humanity might have belonged not to the West, but to the riders of the East. What do you think? Would you choose that world? Or are you grateful for the fragile, tragic, unpredictable one we inherited? Share your thoughts, your doubts, and your visions of history in the comments below. The story, after all, is not finished.